Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today I want to share a deeply personal journey with you. A story about how easy it is to lose yourself in the name of love, and what it truly takes to break free. Have you ever met someone who felt like the answer to all your prayers, only to realize they were actually a beautiful trap? For a long time, I lived in the shadows of another person's life, surviving on fragments of affection and convincing myself it was enough. This is the story of how a quiet coastal town became the backdrop for my greatest heartbreak, and ultimately my truest awakening. Let's dive in. My name is Daniela. For most of my 20s, my world was small, predictable, and safely guarded. I lived in Brighton Bay, a quiet coastal town nestled just far enough from the chaotic energy of New York City to feel like a different planet. At 29, I worked as a front desk receptionist at a boutique hotel right on the water. My life was built on routine. Early morning walks by the shore, a steady job, and a cozy apartment. After surviving a few disastrous relationships in my early 20s, I had built a fortress around my heart. I told myself I was perfectly content being alone, but destiny has a strange way of disrupting our neat little plans when we least expect it. That disruption arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening in the form of a man named Michael. Michael was in town for an extended corporate real estate project. From the moment he approached the desk, he stood out from our usual boisterous weekend tourists. He was soft-spoken, remarkably polite, and carried a subtle air of melancholy in his eyes. As I checked him into his room, our fingers brushed against each other while exchanging the keycard. He looked directly into my eyes, giving me a sincere, lingering smile. "Thank you, Daniela," he said, reading my name tag. "You've made a very long day feel a lot brighter." It was a simple compliment, but the warmth in his voice sent a sudden thrill through me. The next morning, Michael came down to the lobby asking for recommendations around town. I found myself enthusiastically sharing my favorite hidden gems: the quietest stretch of the beach, the local cafe with the best espresso, and the small seafood shack hidden near the old harbor. Unlike most guests who just nod impatiently, Michael listened intently. He absorbed every word, asking follow-up questions and making me feel incredibly valued. Over the next 2 weeks, our brief morning chats evolved into something much deeper. Once his evening meetings concluded, Michael would find me in the lobby. Soon our conversations moved outside the hotel walls. We took long strolls along the shoreline as the sun dipped below the horizon, and sat on the weathered wooden benches near the lighthouse. We talked about everything: our favorite authors, childhood memories, and our deepest fears. He opened up about the suffocating pressure of his high-pressure corporate life in Manhattan, while I shared the quiet comfort of my seaside routine. With Michael, I felt an instant, effortless connection. I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. One crisp, starlit night, as the ocean breeze swirled around us, we stood watching the moonlight reflect off the water. Michael turned to me, his expression deeply tender. "Being near you, Daniela. It feels like finally finding peace," he whispered. My heart melted. That was the exact night I realized I was falling completely in love with him. When his 2 weeks ended, he returned to the city, but our connection only intensified. We texted constantly throughout the day, and our nightly phone calls lasted for hours. I missed him with an intensity that genuinely frightened me. A month later, Michael returned to Brighton Bay. But this time he didn't check into the hotel. Instead, he revealed he had leased a secluded little cottage near the harbor for the season. He invited me over for dinner on his first night back. That evening felt like a beautiful dream. We prepared dinner together, danced carelessly in the kitchen, and shared a level of domestic intimacy that felt entirely permanent. I felt like the luckiest woman alive. But just as I was ready to give him my entire heart, the dream shattered. We were lounging on the sofa, sipping tea, when the atmosphere suddenly shifted. Michael grew uncharacteristically quiet, his eyes fixed on his teacup. He took a long, heavy breath and turned to face me. "Daniela, there is something critical I need to tell you. Something I should have said from the start." My chest tightened, a wave of sudden anxiety washing over me. "What is it, Michael?" He looked down at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. "I'm married," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And I have 2 young children." In a single fraction of a second, the ground beneath my feet dissolved. The man I thought was my perfect future was living a double life. But what hurts more than discovering a lie? It's the choices you make after you know the truth. Stay tuned because what I did next is something I still struggle to forgive myself for. My entire body went completely numb. The warmth of the cottage vanished, replaced by an icy chill that seemed to settle deep into my bones. I couldn't speak. My throat felt completely paralyzed. Michael frantically tried to explain himself, his voice trembling with emotion. I never intended to deceive you, Daniela. I didn't plan for any of this to happen. But my marriage, it's been dead for years. We are roommates raised by duty, staying under one roof solely for the sake of our kids. There is no love left there. Please, you have to believe me. I couldn't process his words. Overwhelmed by a wave of nausea and tears, I shook my head, turned away, and walked the lonely path back to my apartment in total silence. That night was an absolute torment. I paced my dark living room, plagued by agonizing questions. Why hadn't he been honest? Why did I allow myself to get dragged into this? Yet, alongside the sharp sting of betrayal was a terrifying realization. I was already deeply hooked. I kept remembering the safety I felt in his arms, the kindness in his eyes, and the profound loneliness that awaited me if I cut him off. The following morning, a message appeared on my phone. I am so incredibly sorry, Daniela. I never wanted to hurt you. I miss you terribly. I left it on read. For an entire week, I lived like a ghost. I couldn't focus at work, withdrew from my surroundings, and constantly stared at my silent phone. A vicious war was raging between my logic and my longing. Ultimately, my longing won. A week later, we agreed to meet on an isolated stretch of the beach. I told him how deeply devastated I was, how much I loathed the secrecy. Michael didn't offer defensive excuses or false promises. He simply held my hands, looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, I know I have no right to ask this, but I cannot imagine my life without you. And just like that, I surrendered. I chose to stay. I knew it was morally compromised. I knew society would judge me harshly, labeling me as the other woman. But my heart was entirely blinded by hope. I desperately wanted to believe his marriage was just a temporary hurdle, and that if I was patient enough, he would eventually choose me permanently. Thus our secret romance began. Michael would travel to Brighton Bay once or twice a month, staying in that secluded harbor house. I became a master of discretion. I would slip into the cottage late at night after my shifts. Inside those walls, our love felt incredibly genuine. We cooked elaborate meals, analyzed classic films, and shared beautiful silences. He was remarkably attentive. He remembered my favorite books, helped me cook, and kept me laughing. But outside those walls, I didn't exist. We never went out for dinner. We never held hands on the boardwalk. There were no public dates, no shared photographs, and absolutely no discussions about a long-term future. I was living a romance completely confined to the dark. Deep down, the agonizing truth was always there, whispering to me in the quiet moments. I wasn't his partner, I was his escape. I was the convenient, low-maintenance refuge from his real life. Yet I stayed. I loved the version of myself I was when I was with him, and I was utterly terrified of returning to the cold, empty routine of being completely alone. But slowly, the emotional toll began to corrode my spirit. I stopped smiling. I found myself checking my phone hundreds of times a day, entirely dependent on his sporadic text messages for a temporary hit of happiness. I began canceling plans with my lifelong friends, altering my entire schedule just in case he called or decided to visit. My vibrant world shrank down to a single, agonizing variable: Michael's availability. I would stand by the ocean during my lunch breaks, watching the waves and asking myself, is this truly love? Or am I just completely losing my mind? I had traded my peace for a man who could only love me in fractions. But a human soul can only survive in the shadows for so long before it begins to wither away. Next, a sudden awakening from an unexpected source forces me to confront the brutal reality of what I had truly become. As the months rolled by, a profound exhaustion settled deep within my soul. I was entirely consumed by the act of waiting. Waiting for a text, waiting for a weekend visit, waiting for a love that was only mine for a few borrowed hours before it had to be packed away. Whenever Michael left the harbor cottage to return to his family in New York, the emptiness he left behind felt increasingly suffocating. I noticed that he never left a single trace of his existence behind. No spare clothes in the closet, no toothbrush in the bathroom, no stray notes. It was as if he lived two completely separate lives, and in his primary real life I was completely non-existent. Desperate and on the verge of a breakdown, I finally confessed everything to my closest friend, Nina. She was the only person in Brighton Bay who knew the truth. As I wept over my coffee, detailing the agonizing loneliness of being second best, Nina squeezed my hand tightly. Her eyes were fierce with protective love. "Daniela, look at me," Nina said urgently. "You deserve to be someone's first choice. You deserve a partner who is immensely proud to hold your hand in the bright daylight, not someone who hides you away like a shameful secret in the dark." Her words hit me like a physical blow. They resonated deeply within my chest, forcing me to recognize how much of myself I had willingly sacrificed. I had abandoned my passions, stopped reading, isolated myself from friends, and allowed my entire identity to be dictated by a married man's schedule. I tried to console myself with the cliché that real love takes time, but the inner voice grew louder. "Why are you doing this to yourself?" The ultimate confrontation arrived a week later. Michael arrived at the cottage, vibrant and smiling, presenting me with a gorgeous bouquet of flowers. He tried to embrace me, but I stepped back, my expression completely serious. "Michael, we need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. "I can't keep doing this anymore." He looked genuinely startled, setting the flowers down on the counter. "What do you mean, Daniela? Where is this coming from? I thought we were happy." "I am living in your shadow, Michael," I said, tears finally spilling over. "I spend my entire existence waiting for your fragments. I am living my life around your schedule, but I have no actual place in your real world. I want a complete life. I need a real partner." Michael sat down heavily at the table, running his hands through his hair. A long, painful silence stretched between us. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with genuine sorrow. "Daniela, you know how deeply I love you. You know how miserable my home life is. Then leave, Michael," I challenged softly, the words cutting through the quiet room. "Choose me. Let's build a real life in the daylight." He looked away, staring blankly at the floor. It's just not that simple. There are legal assets, families, and my children. I can't just abandon my kids. I can't break their hearts." Hearing those words, a strange, profound calm washed over me. The illusion finally evaporated, replaced by a devastatingly clear reality. He was never going to leave. Not next month, not next year, not ever. "And what about my heart, Michael?" I asked softly. "Am I just the price you pay to keep your escape intact?" He had no answer. That night, as he held me while I cried, it wasn't out of anger. It was the grief of finality. I finally accepted that he was a good man trapped in a bad situation, but he was entirely willing to keep me trapped in the dark with him. The next morning, after he drove away, I made a definitive choice. I didn't text him. I didn't call. I blocked his number and began the agonizing process of reclaiming my life. Walking away from the person you love is the hardest thing a human being can ever do. The silence that followed was deafening, and the temptation to crawl back into the dark was overwhelming. But just when I thought the loneliness would break me, a chance encounter in a local bookstore changed the trajectory of my life forever. Stick around because you won't believe how this story ends. The initial weeks following the breakup were agonizingly heavy. The phantom withdrawal of his presence felt like a physical ache. I missed his laughter, his touch, and the comforting illusion of our shared evenings. There were mornings I clutched my phone, desperate to unblock him, and nights I wept bitterly into my pillow. But instead of feeding the pain, I channeled it into self-care. I forced myself to walk along the shore every morning, letting the brisk ocean wind clear the fog from my brain. I began filling pages of a journal, pouring my grief and realization onto paper. Every sentence I wrote felt like a small brick, rebuilding the foundation of my self-worth. To force myself out of my isolation, I enrolled in an introductory creative writing workshop at our local community center. It was a simple, low-stakes environment designed to help people express themselves. One evening after class, I wandered into a small neighborhood bookstore I hadn't visited in over a year. As I browsed the shelves, a man standing nearby turned and looked at me, a flash of recognition across his face. He was tall, dressed casually, and possessed an incredibly calm, grounding presence. Hi there, he said politely, stepping closer. You're in the Tuesday evening writing workshop, right? I'm David. I sit a few rows behind you. I smiled, a genuine, unforced warmth washing over me. Yes, I am. I'm Daniela. We chatted for 10 minutes right there in the aisle, discussing our class assignments, our favorite authors, and the approaching winter weather. There were no hidden undercurrents, no intense drama. Just a simple, comfortable, and remarkably respectful conversation. The following week, David sat next to me in class. Afterward, he casually invited me across the street for a hot coffee. Our coffee dates quickly became a beautiful weekly tradition. David was a graphic designer who moved to Brighton Bay for its peaceful atmosphere. He was incredibly patient, remarkably transparent, and consistently dependable. When I spoke, he gave me his undivided attention, looking directly into my eyes without any distraction. With David, I didn't feel the frantic, anxious butterflies of a secret romance. I felt a profound, deep-seated sense of safety. Months passed, and our bond grew beautifully. One crisp evening, as we sat on a pier watching a spectacular orange sunset, I felt a strong urge to be entirely honest with him about my baggage. David, before we go any further, there's something you should know about my past, I said, my voice trembling slightly. I was involved with someone who wasn't emotionally available. He was married. I spent a very long time hiding in the dark, waiting to be chosen, and it completely broke me. I vowed to never accept that kind of love again. David remained quiet for a brief moment, processing my words. Then, he reached over and gently placed his hand over mine. His eyes filled with profound respect. Thank you for trusting me with that, Daniela, he said softly. I think you are incredibly courageous for walking away. You deserve a love that is completely yours, and I want you to know I have absolutely nothing to hide. That night I walked home with a profound, radiant warmth radiating from my chest. It wasn't the intoxicating, unstable rush I felt with Michael. It was the solid, unshakable feeling of being truly understood and respected. Over the next year, David became a beautiful, steady presence in my life, like the sun rising gracefully after an incredibly long, dark winter night. He didn't try to save or fix me. He simply stood proudly by my side, showing me through consistent actions what authentic, healthy love actually looks like. We held hands in public, shared our lives openly with friends, and built a foundation entirely free of secrets. One afternoon, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror and smiled. The exhausted, anxious girl who used to hide in the harbor cottage was completely gone. In her place stood Daniela, resilient, grounded, peaceful, and fully alive. Looking back on that painful chapter of my life, I choose not to harbor regret. That painful experience taught me the most invaluable lesson of my life. Love without mutual respect is simply an illusion. Waiting around for someone who cannot fully choose you will only systematically dismantle your self-esteem. True peace isn't something another person can hand to you. It's something you must bravely cultivate within yourself. Today I finally have that peace. I have a beautiful, flourishing life, and I have a deep, profound love. Not from someone who hides me away in the shadows, but from a true partner who proudly walks right beside me in the light. If you are out there right now surviving on fragments of someone else's time, remember this. You are entirely worthy of being the main event, never the secret side story. Thank you so much for listening to my journey. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, take care of your heart.